$68 billion. That's how much the U.S. Department of Education will spend in 2009. So what exactly are we getting for that money? Well, according to the ED's website, the ED's website, the money went to establishing policies on federal financial aid for education, as well as distributing and monitoring those funds. 2, collecting data on America's schools and disseminating research. And 3, focusing national attention on key educational issues. I'm sure they would take issue with having it defined so simply, but that is how they define it on their website, and the price tag associated with that is $68 billion. So, is it worth it? Joining us to discuss whether or not we have a need for a federal Department of Education, Dan Mitchell, Cato Institute Senior Fellow, Christian Weller, Center for American Progress Senior Fellow, Associate Professor of Public Policy at UMass Boston. Gentlemen, I want you to know, when this came up a couple weeks ago or last week, I said, this is a good one, we'll have you back, and I want you to just note we're doing it, because it was, I was glad when you raised it. Okay, so Dan, $68 billion for a federal Department of Education. Is it worth it?
It's a big, giant waste of money. We should get rid of the Department of Education, tear down the building, put a foot of salt over the ground so nothing can ever spring up again. Since the Department of Education was created, we spent more than $1.5 trillion, and our test scores have stagnated. We have fallen behind other nations. The reason for this is simple. Taking money in a leaky bucket to Washington, letting a bunch of bureaucrats foist paperwork and regulations and mandates on the states, that's a recipe for centralization, inefficiency, monopoly. Ronald Reagan was right when he said we should get rid of the Department of Education. It's been a disaster for American students, and it's been a disaster for American taxpayers. Let's just look to the north of us. Canada has no federal Department of Education. It's entirely in the provinces, and Canada spends less than we do, and they get better test scores than we do.
Christian, he makes a very compelling case.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think the federal government is there to set national standards and to uphold those national standards. This is a national labor market. We want to be the most competitive economy in the world. And the recent trends towards national standard setting and the No Child Left Behind have borne fruit. We clearly are doing better in achievement. And that's only one of the roles that the federal Department of Education is playing. The other part is to really help the most vulnerable students, and there is a lot of money under No Child Left Behind that's going to students who grow up in high poverty, minority students, dual English speakers, and migrant workers, kids of migrant workers. So there is a lot of stuff going on at the federal level, but it is only a very small part of the overall education system. In the K through 12, the federal government is spending less than 9% of the overall education spending. And the numbers that you cited, the $68 billion, are a little bit misleading because it includes the extra spending this year from the stimulus bill. Typically, the federal government spends about $46 billion.
Right, although they are getting an increase. So they've put in
getting
for
an increase this year and an increase
1.2%.
next year. But that goes to the third point, and that is we do have a crumbling education infrastructure. We have leaky roofs. We have a lot of students in containers. We have a lot of students who are in classrooms that are not well heated or well cooled in the summer. And that's really, I think, an area where the federal government can help out and can spend more money without interfering in curriculum or teacher choices. Christian, isn't part of the problem there? I mean, we fund by property tax. So aren't we sort of in a system where if you live in a rich neighborhood, you pay a higher property tax and your child gets a better education than someone in a poor neighborhood? There's some equalization at the state level. I mean, and I think there's a good argument to have the states run their own education system, set their own priorities. They are closer to the ground. They know what the labor force looks like. They know what their population looks like. But on the other hand, you do have to have national standards. I mean, there is a national labor market out there. And really, I mean, the standards that we've set over the last few years have worked. And that's ultimately the lesson we need to take back from this.
Yeah, but
that the federal government, continuing this route.
But we used to have no federal Department of Education, and our education was improving more. I agree with you. We should care about poor kids. But the best way to help poor kids is to get rid of the federal Department of Education and let states and local governments voucherize or give tax credits. Break up the inefficient government school monopoly. The entire Department of Education was a payoff to the teachers union, and now Barack Obama is standing in the schoolhouse door, just like George Wallace, saying no to school choice. Let's not let these poor kids escape these failing monopoly schools. I think this is the civil rights
What
issue.
explicitly?
Well, let me like, I think when you look at vouchers, when you look at vouchers, you look at other movements. They tend to exacerbate some of the inequities that Erin mentioned earlier, and clearly, I think the federal government is there to somewhat level the playing field, and the states haven't done a particularly good job.
And
in some cases, like New Hampshire, you actually have civil rights cases where ultimately the property taxes are bumping up against real civil rights challenges.
I would imagine, and that, by the way, is a conversation I would love to have, because the property tax issue is a huge one. But Christian, could you make the case, so Dan can respond, as to if it went away tomorrow, the entire Department of Education, what is one specific, measurable, important thing that we would lose?
I think what we clearly would lose is a national standard that we're all striving forward, and it's everybody for themselves in the global economy.
You mean like a standardized test score?
A standardized test scores. We basically would use yardstick here, and that ultimately is undesirable in a world where we're trying to become more competitive in order to grow our economy at a faster rate so we can raise our
So you think we should be teaching to the test as the...
Well, there are some concerns about that, but again, I mean, you talk to teachers, you talk to school officials. I think many school districts have managed to find a good balance between teaching to the tests and ultimately teaching other skills. The results seem to indicate that we've been raising our achievements in all areas that matter: writing, reading, math, and other subject matters. So I think what you're losing is a leveling up mechanism, and the other part is a mechanism to kind of finance and rebuild our education infrastructure.
Okay, Dan, final word to you. If it went away tomorrow, what is one gap that might be created we'd need to deal with? Or are there none? Oh,
we'd have a lot of useless federal bureaucrats who would suddenly have to get new jobs. That's the only thing we would lose. I find it very instructive that Christian is siding with big government George Bush, whose no bureaucrat left behind education bill helped
this
create
is not
a lot
a partisan
of these
issue.
problems.
This was a bipartisan bill between Kennedy and President Bush.
Yeah, two big government politicians agreeing to screw over taxpayers and create more.
It's going to be very hard to make the argument that President Bush really liked big government.
For our next conversation, Dan, if you're saying look at Canada on education, what would you say? Look at Canada in terms of health care. Okay. All right. We'll talk about that next time. I knew you'd be shaking your head, and I knew Christian would be laughing.
Thanks
to
very
both
much.
of you.